heinous crime of selling and buying human beings is a very dark stain on the conscience of humanity. Africa suffered a lot from the activities of the transatlantic slave trade, which saw millions of Africans carted across the oceans, totally throwing away dignity and humanity. The trade in enslaved Africans saw a number of forts built by European slave traders all over Africa. A whopping 28 forts sit on the coast of Ghana, formerly called the Gold Coast, alone, which served as a conduit pipe for the smooth slave trade business. In all, UNESCO documented 32 forts and castles along Ghana's coast, with 4 of them in ruins right now. In our new series of Ghana's slave dungeons, we want to visit all these forts and see the impact of this slave trade on our people. A fort is a fortified building against aggression with strategic positioning. A castle is purely for residential purposes, whilst a fort or a fortress is a military base, most of the time to fight aggression and to keep ammunition and slaves. Now, the first fort I decided to visit, Fort Good Hope, translated from the Dutch into English as Fort Good Hope. It was built as a small rest stop or lodge for Dutch sailors in 1667 in Senya Breku, a residential area located in the Ewutu Senya West District of the Central Region in Ghana. In 1694, 27 years after Fort Good Hope was built, the English built Fort Winneba in Winneba, only 35 kilometers away. This was seen as a great threat to the Dutch, so they abandoned Fort Good Hope, only to return 10 years later in 1704 to seek to build a fort from the lodge. The Queen of Agona gave permission to the Dutch, who fortified their 10-year-old abandoned fort. It became a full-fledged fort. The Dutch called the fort Good Hope. That's Good Hope because their gold trade expanded the moment they built the fort. In 1667, they jumped into the slave trade business, expanding the fort to twice its size in 1715. The Dutch put 100 slaves in this dungeon with no ventilation except for the hole in the roof, where food was also lowered once in a while to the slaves to scramble over. They crammed up the slaves from the hinterlands to see who the fittest were before investing in them as to shipping them across the oceans through the Elmina Castle to Europe and the Caribbean. The female dungeon here took a total of 50 slaves at a time, and you can see that this one had good ventilation, as the women were supposed to be kept fresh for the sexual exploitation of the Dutch sailors. The Dutch lived a total of 115 years in Fort Good Hope, but actively engaged in slave trading for 80 years, until the English captain Thomas Shirley in a 15-gun Leander and the sloop of war Alligator arrived in the Dutch Gold Coast and seized all the Dutch forts, including Fort Good Hope. Approximately 200,000 slaves were housed and shipped away from Fort Good Hope in a period of 80 years by the Dutch alone. A tunnel was built from the fort into the sea for easy slave transfer. Your guess is as good as mine. When the English seized Fort Good Hope, they continued the slave trade business. Today, Fort Good Hope is a drinking spot and a guest house for locals in the area. Next to nothing has been done to preserve the original edifice except some painting. The curator lives here with his family and operates a drinking spot in one of the dungeons. Personal belongings have also been packed in the other storerooms or dungeons. Now the gates of no return, where blindfolded slaves left the Gold Coast for good, now has been sealed and houses wild bats who frightened us despite the warning that there were bats in the gateway. Fort Good Hope will remain one of the very early forts built on the coast of the Gold Coast, today called Ghana, exactly 30 years after the Elmina Castle was built. Fort Good Hope still tells the story of how innocent Africans were enslaved and carried away, a lot of who never returned to their families. 4 captains of the various ships that came to Fort Good Hope died from malaria and some other such sicknesses, and they were given befitting burials. And you can see their graves here properly marked, though without their names. Nobody has ever dug out the bones to test them and find out when they exactly died, or even the names of these captains. Don't ask me about what happened to the black enslaved men and women who died here. They were simply thrown back into the sea and they became food for the fish. The sea came all the way to the foot of this fort. Now there is a barricade, a sea defense wall that prevents the water from coming all over to the fort. The captains stood up on top of the fort and enjoyed some good breeze, whilst the security men who ran shifts used this portion as their guard room. And all these cannons that you see were 22 in number. Today there are only a few that can be accounted for right here. Now this room was uncompleted, in fact, by the Dutch, and it served as an ammunition room. It never ever was completed. The story of Fort Good Hope or Fort Good Hope in the series of our visits to the slave dungeons of Ghana. How many more slaves were carried away by the British from Fort Good Hope? Your guess is as good as mine. This is the African History class and is in the series of the dungeons of the Gold Coast.